Alright everybody, today I want to talk about the new Luck and Strike mods that just got added to the game. I've been calling them the anti-crit mods, and basically what they do, and they're all listed right there, is that basically they give you a bunch of skill power or skill power modifier in exchange for absolutely dumpstering your skill critical hit stats, right? Now if we look at my new bunny build that I just finished, you'll see I've replaced my original 4 critical hit mods with just the 2 anti-crit mods. Of course, being electric amplification and singular amplification in the case of Bunny. Now for the actual numbers on these, for the elemental amplification mods, you've got 65.4% elemental skill power and minus 140% skill critical hit damage. And for the ability type, so singular, tech, dimension, so on, you've got 61.3% skill power modifier, and of course it reduces your skill critical hit rate by 140%. This doesn't go into the negatives or give you like a negative crit or anything. Your crit rate just simply goes to 0 and you just won't be able to crit at all, of course. And of course, the really nice thing about the mods, again, is that you effectively replace 4 mods with only 2 mods. And in the case of characters that have low critical hit rate, this can often turn into higher average damage per hit than a full damage crit mod or crit build. Like this build, for example, I have all 4 crit mods, but actually this version of the build does more damage on hit per average, especially if you factor in for critical hit resistance, which is a multiplier to your final crit rate, and it essentially multiplies that down. For example, if you have a 50% crit rate and they have a 20% skill critical hit resistance, the boss does, for example, your final crit rate will be 40%. So of course, with this, you don't have to worry about that at all. You don't crit at all, you just get a bunch of damage. And like I said, this build actually does more damage per hit on average than a full damage crit build with the same, with all the same things. And of course, it's much tankier as well. I've got Battle of Stamina and Spirit and Shield. Battle of Stamina for a little bit of extra duration is kind of the main reason I put this on, but you also get Spirit and Shield for the extra skill power and a little extra defense. But because I've got these extra tank mods on, I can actually very comfortably run the full Slayer set on Bunny and still end with 16,000 defense and 10,000 max HP, leading for a build that's very comfy and does a lot of damage. Now, talk is cheap, so let's see some actual results. This is the non-crit Slayer version of the build, and you see with full meter, my high voltage takes for 692,000 damage, and the dot does 165,000 damage as well. Now, if I switch to the crit version of the build, this will be using the Slayer set, you'll see that I crit for 1.5 million damage. Of course, this is only 30% of the time because her crit rate is only base 10%. My meter back. You refilled 1.5, basically 1.6 million damage, a little over double the damage, non-crit damage of around 390,000, I think that was, and ticks of only 79,000. Of course, those can crit as well. Now, if you do the math here, you will find that damage per average here is actually slightly higher for crits, but that's because you're probably not factoring in for critical hit resistance. And they're about the same anyways. They're almost exactly the same. They're very close. But once you factor in for basically any critical hit resistance at all, the non-crit version of the build comes ahead. And when you consider that even this enemy right here has 5% critical hit resistance, any enemy where it will matter will have enough critical hit resistance that the non-crit build comes ahead in terms of average damage per hit. That is also not considering the fact that this build right here is very squishy, and I would not normally run this. I would normally run this set right here, which gives me a lot more HP and defense, and I end up being a lot more survivable, but I also lose a lot of damage. My crits going all the way down to only 1.2 million from the 1.4 million I had before, right? So basically the trade-off here is you do more damage on average per hit, and you are tankier. That is the trade-off for running the non-crit version of the build. So yes, it's basically just better in every single way, right? And of course, if you don't want to use Slayer and you want to be extra tanky, you can do that as well, right? There's nothing stopping you from, losing that extra damage from the Slayer set and going super tanky. My build has 20,000 defense and 16,000 HP. Very tanky. You're hardly ever going to die with this much bulk unless you're just standing in front of really dangerous attacks and not moving out of the way. So for those of you who want to see the actual math, you can see the formula I'm using here is base damage times crit rate times crit damage plus the base damage times 1 minus the critical hit rate. This is how I'm finding the average damage per hit. I just noticed a typo. The average damage per hit, I rounded all these numbers, by the way, just for convenience. So without factoring in for crit resistance, you're looking at a total of 755,790 average damage per hit with the crit rate build. And the damage per hit of the non-crit build is 692,304, which is a 60,000 damage difference. Of course, this is not considering for survivability difference, and also we haven't even started to factor in for critical hit resistance yet, right? Now, if we look at a boss with 20% critical hit resistance, which most bosses have around this or more, we already see the non-crit build start pulling ahead of the critical hit resistance build just in terms of average damage per hit. And if you're curious about that generic enemy of 5% critical hit resistance, you can see it does 737,000 average damage per hit to that enemy right there, which is already down to only 40,000 more damage than the non-crit build. But for enemies like that, it's pretty relevant. They're going to die in one hit anyways. So of course, the really benefit here is that the damage difference is pretty small. We're also not factoring in for defense here. So these damage differences are likely going to get squished down a bit by defense. But basically, we're looking for very similar average damage per hit, but with the non-crit build, we have significantly more survivability. And that is why, in my opinion, it's a far better overall build for Bunny. There's also no reliance on crit RNG. You don't have to worry about getting super unlucky and just not critting. And you don't have to worry about crit resistance. You know, for example, some bosses have extremely high crit resistance, like Gluttony, for example, I believe has a skill critical hit resistance of 80% or something ridiculous like that. So you don't have to worry about that with this build. Now, before we wrap up, I want to give everyone who supports the channel as a member or just watches, likes, subscribes, all those things, a big thank you, because your support helps a lot. It really means a lot to me. Hoping for this channel to eventually grow and for it to become like a proper full-time career at some point. So again, your support really means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. Thank you guys, as always. Now, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.